Good afternoon. I hope you had a wonderful lunch, and I'm excited to visit with you this afternoon about energy independence and how energy independence starts with the states. On the panel with me today are two gentlemen that I know very, very well, and I want to introduce them now and ask them to come out. The first is Bob Sullivan. Bob Sullivan is the owner of Sullivan & Company, a family-owned independent oil and gas exploration company with more than 50 years of service. Bob served as the Secretary of Energy for former Oklahoma Governor Frank Keating and also Brad Henry. So, Bob, can you join us on the stage? Let's welcome Bob Sullivan. David Rifkin is the other panelist with me this afternoon. David is an attorney at the firm Baker Hostetler in Washington, D.C., where he leads the firm's appellate practice. But let me say this about David before I get into the rest of the bio. David was the attorney who brought the individual mandate case that ended up being litigated and heard ultimately before the U.S. Supreme Court in June of 2012. David was the author of that case with Florida, so he's been a great champion for individual liberty and challenging the Affordable Care Act. But he has extensive experience in the energy and environmental issues in the law, and David has developed and implemented a legislative, regulatory, and litigation initiative for 2 presidential administrations. David, if you could join us on stage. David Rifkin, please. I want to say thank you to both of you for joining us on the panel and your perspectives today. And I just want to begin with a few opening comments before we get into questions. Energy independence truly does start with the states. I think many times people look at the energy revolution and renaissance that's going on across this country, for instance, with hydraulic fracturing, and they think that fracturing process just began 10 or 15 years ago. As you know, in the state of Oklahoma, we began regulating hydraulic fracturing in 1948. And we've had a robust regulatory regime since that time and have been actively involved in that. What happened about 10 to 12 years ago was technology was applied to hydraulic fracturing that allowed us to drill down 2 miles and go left or right 2 miles and actually access oil and natural gas in our shale rock face that we could not reach before. And so the renaissance that we see in this country is substantial, particularly in Oklahoma. I don't know if you know this or not, but 1 in 7 individuals in the state of Oklahoma are employed by an energy company and supported by energy. And this energy boom has given us an opportunity, truly for the first time, to maintain energy independence. Recently, I read a statistic that only 26% of our energy, oil that is being imported presently. So we have the opportunity to actually have energy independence and beyond that, export oil to Europe and elsewhere. And so it's a very exciting time. But the only thing that's holding us back, unfortunately, is Washington, D.C. We have an EPA, we have a federal government that is actively involved in picking winners and losers and using regulatory power to penalize fossil fuels to elevate renewables. And just one quick fact for you. The state of Oklahoma generates about 15% of its electricity through wind. That is substantial, puts us in the top 4 in the country. And so we've been very aggressive as a state to diversify the way we generate electricity, but still yet, we see this administration trying to use its power and the EPA to penalize states like Oklahoma with respect to picking renewables over oil and gas and fossil fuels. So we're going to talk about that today on the panel. Both of these gentlemen, from an industry perspective and a legal perspective, I think are going to bring great perspective to you on what we're facing as a country and the opportunities we have to respond as a collection of states. So with that, I'm going to ask the first question of Mr. Bob Sullivan. Bob, there's always talk about an all-of-the-above energy strategy at the federal level. To put the infrastructure, and what steps can be taken at the federal level to allow America's energy producers to develop the resources with which our country is blessed? So this all-of-the-above strategy, what does that mean to you at the federal level, and how does that relate to the state's role?
Well, all of the above means, of course, oil and gas, coal, renewables, all nuclear, everything. And when I served as Secretary of Energy for the state of Oklahoma, I wrote actually the first energy policy for the state. And I subscribe to the all of the above as long as the leveling world of economics justifies it. And so I believe in it conceptually. However, any of the above is subject to punitive measures by the federal government. We need to keep the decision-making, the regulation of all this energy, all these different energy sources at the state level. And we need to access, most of all, we need to keep the federal government from stifling the private sector, private enterprise entrepreneurialism, which gives rise to better, cheaper energy. We just witnessed a perfect example of that. Our imports, as Scott said, they're up in the high 50%. They're now in the mid 20%. And that all took place because of technology developed by the private sector, not by federal government. And it was the private sector that perfected the fracking techniques, perfected horizontal drilling. I engage in that every day, all day, and we are doing things now we hadn't even heard of 6 or 7 years ago. So leave us alone, let us get out of the way, and let us solve the problem just like we just solved the import problem.
I can just add.
Thanks, Bob.
I can just add the all of the above is rhetoric. The reality of this administration's policy is incredible hostility towards fossil fuels. That includes oil and gas. As my colleague just mentioned, all the breakthroughs in the exploration and production of oil and gas are not only not attributable or creditable to this administration, they're actually done despite everything the administration has done. And the administration has also been waging, and we'll talk about it a little bit more, a real war on coal. It's not a rhetorical war. I joke from time to time, but it's not funny. But this administration was as robust dealing with Al-Qaeda, ISIS. We would not have a problem in the Middle East if it would be as robust as they're dealing with coal. So they're really trying to hurt coal in every way possible for regulatory means by giving tremendous subsidies to renewables. And don't get me wrong, renewables are indeed a part of all the above strategy in appropriate circumstances. In a state like Oklahoma, wind is a very valuable commodity, but trying to wheel electricity generated by wind thousands of miles and have over-line losses is certainly not the way to proceed. So you really have to be true to the rhetoric if it's going to make any sense.
David, I want to ask you about something you know very well, the EPA and its constitutional authority to do some of the things it's doing with respect to regulatory power. Can you speak to just a couple of areas that EPA is engaged in that you're concerned about with respect to their overreach under the Constitution or statutorily?
Yeah, thank you, Scott. The biggest problem is something that EPA has misnamed the Clean Power Plan, which is really anti-power plan. And let me say this, as important as oil is to the transportation sector, affordable and reliable electricity is the backbone of our lives. And ever since electricity was invented and commercialized, the states have had the primary regulatory role in this area. Now, not to say that the federal government plays no role. FERC regulates in a careful manner the interstate markets, so-called bulk power sales. The states, however, remain dominant in regulating retail power sales, which is generation, distribution of electricity. Now, EPA, for the first time, is misconstruing the certain provisions of the Clean Air Act to give its authority to force states to change their generating mix and a variety of other measures relating to demand and conservation in an effort to reduce by 30% carbon intensity of electricity being generated, which really, put it simplistically, would basically lead to taking offline roughly 30% of coal-fired capacity. That is going to lead to serious problems, both as to affordability, which is very important, both for our families and for the American industry, but also as to reliability. And I don't need to tell anybody who had to live through a hot day or a cold day how important it is to have reliable electricity. So it's a horrible idea as a matter of policy. And as Scott implied, EPA is misconstruing the statute, that they're doing more than that. They're doing it so blatantly, they're really rewriting the statute. This is one of those instances, and the Obama administration has done it relative to immigration, has done it relative to Obamacare itself. They're really functioning as a legislature one. And that violates horizontal separation of powers, which is one of the backbones of our constitutional architecture. But what's particularly bad about this, that in the process, they're also coercing the states and commandeering the states, which have a term of art that we get out of cases dealing with federalism. So they're violating both horizontal separation of powers and vertical separation of powers. And one of the worst parts, they're doing it not in an accountable fashion. They're really forcing the states to take responsibility, continued political an economic responsibility for weakened reliability and damaged affordability, while not saying we're not doing that. So they're forcing the states to regulate in a way they themselves cannot do. And that's a serious problem. I think this is utterly unconstitutional. And I believe with General Pruitt's leadership, this is going to go down. But the very fact that they're trying is a very distressing thing.
You know, if I could add before, Bob's got a visual aid that you're going to enjoy here in a second. He's pulling out of his bag, so he's getting the visual aid ready, and it's going to be exciting. I think you're going to. There's no animals in the bag, okay? So he's going to use a visual aid you're going to like. But you know, to add to what David just said, you know, when you look at environmental laws, particularly the Clean Air Act, it was intended from the very beginning, passed in the 1970s, that it be cooperative with the states. In fact, you'll see all throughout the Clean Air Act references to state implementation plans because states do a better job at balancing the economic factors with the environmental objectives that we have under the statute. And that's been long recognized for decades. But what this administration is doing that's different is they're saying you can adopt a state implementation plan. That's fine. In fact, we recognize that right under the statute. So long as it agrees with federal will, so long as the states act as a vessel of federal will, we'll accept it. But if you somehow choose a different path, if you want to have an energy mix that is heavy on natural gas and not something else, then we're going to, reject that and then force a federal plan upon the states. That's happened in Oklahoma. It happened with the regional haze portion of the Clean Air Act, where we are now facing as a state double-digit increases in our electricity cost because the federal government had the, I believe, unlawful action of forcing a federal plan upon the state that was wrong. And so what David is talking about, you know, these federalism principles and statutory construction, we sometimes think they're very legal and esoterical, and they're real. I mean, they affect the cost that it turns to turn these lights on and to heat and cool our homes in that hot summer and cold winter. And I think this administration, unfortunately, is not at all concerned with the cost. If costs go up substantially to the tune of 30 to 40%, they're not very concerned about that because that will force conservation. And they want less use of energy to begin with. So they're going to use that power to achieve that end anyway. So with that, Bob, why don't you show us your visual aid, because I think you've got a good visual aid.
I'm going to make you wait a couple more minutes.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Because I want to respond to this general subject anyway. The Oklahoma Corporation Commission is responsible for all of the oil and gas activity in this state and has been since, I believe, 1935. And I've had a pretty strong taste of dealing with the federal government on permits and requirements for environmental compliance with the federal folks and comparing that to the Oklahoma Corporation Commission. And it is night and day. The Oklahoma Corporation Commission regulates the industry I'm in, and everybody needs some regulation, a little bit. And the people that we deal with are professionals. They're geologists, they're engineers, they're administrative law people versed in the petroleum industry. So when we sit down with them about a problem around a permit or around anything, we end up talking, they understand our business, and we understand their need for reasonable regulation. When we're talking with federal people, with all due respect, some general statement, but it's true, even the terminology, they don't understand our business. And as a result, we end up having to do all kinds of things that are overkill in terms of complying with the regulations that they have promulgated that are counterproductive in the oil and gas business, and I'm sure other businesses too. So keep it in the states and staff the state's regulatory bodies with people who understand what they're regulating.
Scott, just 10 seconds, if I
Yes,
may.
David.
Those practical realities demonstrate the genius of our framers. Federalism is not just about not giving the federal government too much power, although it's important. Federalism is choosing to have the majority of regulatory tasks carried out at the state and local level, which is inherently more accountable and frankly more competent, as I think my colleague just explained. So this is a perfect fusion of a Constitution and practical realities of life.
Bob, I want to ask a question about access to oil and gas on federal lands. If it were opened up, and we know this administration likes to brag about how much production and exploration was going on prior to the last downturn, but most, if not all, that growth was on private lands, as you know.
Most of it.
So if access to oil and gas on federal lands were opened up, what would that mean for consumers, manufacturing, and the energy industry, do you think, in this country?
Is access to federal lands?
Yes.
Well, we as an industry have continually perfect techniques, as I said earlier, that are more and more effective in extracting oil and gas out of the ground. And by the way, a little factoid for those who are not familiar with the industry, when the smartest people in the world, whether it's Exxon or a small guy like me, we get approximately 20% of the oil in place with primary production. There are some secondary production techniques that might get, if successful, another 20%. But over half of the oil in the reservoirs that have been found in this country is still there. So, and technology is perfecting techniques that can get another crop out of it. So if federal lands were opened up, we could take the knowledge that we have perfected on private lands and apply those to federal lands. And guess what? The federal government would get a royalty out of that. So,
well, speaking of royalties, I see this in my notes, and we've talked about this. It's been estimated that over time, the federal government could generate $19 trillion in royalties from drilling on federal lands, more than enough to eliminate our national debt. Now, if you think that those in Congress in Washington, D.C. would come to the states across this country and say, here's the deal, we're going to open up federal lands, generate $19 trillion of royalties, and dedicate that exclusively to retiring the national debt, which is $18 trillion, that sounds like a good idea. David, I think you know that here pretty quickly the administration, the EPA, is going to adopt through this Clean Power Plan, the Rule 111D as it's known, and that's supposed to happen next month. They proposed that rule last June. Oklahoma, along with several other states, have filed comment about the unlawfulness of that action, but it looks like they're going to finalize that next month. Explain how this latest attempt by the EPA to insert itself in the state's realm of regulation is unlawful and problematic from your perspective.
Well, just to, thank you, Scott, just to build on what I was saying earlier, the states have responsibility for generation and distribution of electricity. If it's done by public utility commissions and done in environmentally sound manner, it takes years, ladies and gentlemen, to build power plants, in part because of federal regulatory requirement, a little bit because of state. So what we have is the industry term is generating fleet, which is basically how you get electricity and how businesses get electricity for what they need. And the way you operate this fleet is what is known as a least cost dispatch, because you want to make sure that the electricity that reaches you and the industry is not only affordable, but is as inexpensive as possible. What EPA wants to do is to disrupt all that equilibrium, and again, do it very precipitously, not do it over a period of decades, and force the states to basically retire, or either completely retire, not run 30% of their coal-fired capacity. Now, coal-fired capacity these days is because of a natural gas revolution. A lot of power plants switch to natural gas, but still, coal is responsible for roughly 40% of generating capacity, and particularly for what is known as the baseload capacity, which is the capacity that has to run in every day. Once that happens, you gravely disrupt the grid. You are much less reliable, and again, the margins that you have to meet peak capacity are more in a single-digit territory. So if you're forced to retire 30% with nothing to replace it, you're going to have huge problems in a variety of states. And again, what's pernicious about it, the way EPA wants to do it, unlike many other areas, instead of taking it over completely or threatening to take it over completely and at least be accountable for those problems, they're saying to the states, no, you really do our bidding, which is where the coercion comes from. I think it's tremendously unlawful. I'm confident it would be challenged well and be taken down. But the very fact that it's been proposed already has pernicious consequences. It ties up the capital. It's not easy for people to go out and raise money because who wants to invest in an industry that is under attack? And again, back to my war analogy, it's actually not an analogy. The administration calls it war and call. At least in one respect, this president has been clear from the very beginning. When he was running for office the first time, he made a couple of remarks speaking to an audience in California where he said, I'm going to make it impossible for people to build a power plant, or if it's possible, I'm going to make sure it bankrupts them. And he is pretty well succeeding in that effort.
And unfortunately, all inconsistent with the statute. One thing that David said that I want to highlight for you is that when you combine coal, natural gas, and oil, fossil fuels, that's responsible for about 70% of our baseload energy as far as electricity is concerned. And so, rhetorically, the question of those that advance renewables in the place of fossil fuels, when you're a state like Oklahoma that's already using 15% renewables to generate electricity, where do you go to reach a 30% reduction in CO2? The administration knows that. Several years ago, they tried to pass cap and trade through Congress, and it failed. And so the president is doing what he does routinely. He's taking cap and trade without the trade and doing it through rulemaking and capitating that on a state-by-state basis. And it's entirely inconsistent with the statute. I will say to you, we are going to sue as a state. If they finalize this rule next week and they don't change course, Oklahoma is going to be joining with a bunch of other states to say, EPA, you've acted unlawfully, and it's coming quickly.
Is it time for what's in the bag?
I'm sorry?
Is it time for what's in the bag?
I don't know what to ask you to get it out, but whatever it is, you got it.
Okay.
Yeah.
This is more than anecdotal. I've been operating in the mid-continent states, oil and gas provinces for 35 years. And up in one county in Oklahoma, Osage County, it's all Indian land, and there's only one mineral owner in the entire county, and that's the tribe. It was a great place to do business in that you just had to deal with one mineral owner, and you could sit down with them and work with them, and it was fine. They are regulated or overseen by the BIA. Well, the Osage tribe did a wonderful thing in 1979. Rather than make each operator go out and get an environmental assessment every time you wanted to drill a well or get a permit, the tribe got an environmental study for the entire county. And so it made things nice and smooth for the people like us to come in and get permits. Well, that set of rules that they promulgated back then, the tribe adopted, BIA put out, is right here. It's 21 pages, and it got a ton of wells drilled and a lot of royalty created for the tribe, and operators were pleased with it. Along comes a more recent. Thank you. Along comes a more recent.
This is 1979.
79. Recently, a new set of rules came out. Okay. This is just the rules. This is just the new rules that we need to go by. A friend of mine, a fellow operator, you better have some muscles there, big boy.
I've been lifting.
A friend of mine just went to get, under the new set of rules, to get permits for 10 wells in a close area. They're all the same. They're very shallow, not expensive. And he was going to go in there even at $55 or whatever. He thought he could make some money. And so he had to comply with that second batch. There it is. Now, this is in a county that has 14,000 producing wells in it. The entire county produces 13,000 barrels a day, less than 1 barrel a day. And the cost of this, what he had to do in dollars, literally made the project uneconomic. So there you have it. You talk about a chokehold on an industry. Regulation is literally just shut down, at least in that county, has shut down drilling. One other factoid, and I'll shut her down myself. A separate example. Another operator friend of mine drilled 2 wells about 6 miles apart to the same zone, same depth, vertical holes, not the fancy new horizontal fracking and everything. And one of them was had some private Indian land, which brought it under the BIA and the BLM regulations. And he had to comply with that in one well and not in the other. So he has a good snapshot of the incremental cost of what it takes to comply with the environmental regulations now in place. The one without the federal government involved, he spent $77,000 in complying with the environmental part of his well. The well cost $300,000 or something. $77,000 for that. Over on the one where he had to comply with the BIA and the BLM, it's $222,000, 3 times what it cost without those regulations. So, and the one without regulations was under state corporation commission requirements. So I'm babbling on this because it's very real, folks. It does shut down activity. And those numbers do not include that gentleman's time and effort, management focus on it, to get it all done. So regulation isn't just rhetoric. It's real, and it curtails productive activity that otherwise would take place.
You know, this is not, as Bob knows, this is not about making sure that when a well is drilled in Oklahoma that's done in a safe way, in a sound way, it's about what? Stopping the well from ever being drilled.
That's the real agenda.
And that's what this is about, is using regulatory power of this weight to try to keep what? Production from happening, and it's a problem in the state of Oklahoma and across the country. Thanks, Bob, for sharing that. Last question, because I think we've got, David, you had a comment?
Just very briefly, it shows you the tremendous resilience of American economy, but despite all those regulatory burdens, we're not exactly sprinting, but we're still growing. That's right. You can imagine if we lifted those burdens, hopefully in the next administration, exactly, how much better off we'll be.
I mean, gross domestic product in this country in the 2% to 3% range. Imagine what it'd be if the federal government would get out of the way. Last question, and this is something you may know a little bit about, but it's a question to David about a phenomena called sue and settle, where an environmental group will, endangered species or Clean Air Act or another federal law, an environmental group will sue the EPA and say, EPA, you should be regulating in a particular way under the Clean Air Act, or you should be regulating in a particular way under the Endangered Species Act. And they'll sue, and before the case is ever litigated, the EPA will raise the white flag and walk into court and say, you got us. Sometimes the very day that the lawsuit is initiated. And then they'll enter into something called a consent decree, and they'll file it with the federal judge. And in that consent decree, they will comply or agree to do things that the statute doesn't require them to do. And they'll do it in California. And then they'll come to Oklahoma and say, Oklahoma, you've got to do this. And we'll say, no, we don't. The statute says this. And they'll say, well, we don't care. The federal judge in California said that you have to, and we're going to make you do it. It's called sue and settle, and they're regulating through litigation. And David, I'd like for you to speak to how pernicious that is and how the EPA is using that process to bypass rulemaking to impact energy development in this country.
You described it perfectly. It's extremely pernicious. It's always been pernicious. It's gone on in every administration. It's gone on with gusto in this administration. It does several things. What it really does, it removes any opportunity through the rulemaking process to stop bad things. And what it also does, it enables EPA to, in fact, delegate the responsibility for making public policy to extremist environmental organizations. Because believe me, ladies and gentlemen, they don't sue in the sue and settle context, sua sponte on their own. There's a lot of winking and nodding going on here. So the EPA would go to a group and say, sue us in this particular district court. As Scott said, we throw in the white flag, and then the die is cast. Very, very difficult to stop this. And transparency is important. Filing FOIA requests is important, and then frankly pushing back against bureaucrats who do that is important, but certainly not going to happen in this administration's watch. But that is a particularly pernicious practice within the universe of other pernicious practices, which we can spend a couple of hours discussing if we had it.
Bob, you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, one quick thing. To me, I've talked about cost of compliance and so on. To me, the greatest cost we haven't even mentioned, and that is the squelching of the spirit inside of America's entrepreneurs, just providers, heads of households that want to take care of their families. The choking of that instinct, a God-given instinct, by these regulations is the biggest cost to me. And just one more sentence. Thurgood Marshall, the first African-American Supreme Court justice, said it best. Our whole constitutional heritage rebels at the thought of giving government the power to control men's minds. Amen.
Well said. And I want to say thank you to David and Bob for their participation. on the panel.
Thank you, David. Good to be with you.
I think Bob said it well. This is about opportunity. And prayerfully, as we go into the 2016 presidential cycle, we're going to elect a president that recognizes that we have immense opportunity because of the technology, the capital infrastructure, the ability of industry to truly be in the business of energy independence. Hopefully, and I believe this, our nominee will know that it starts with the states. And I really appreciate Bob and David's participation today to demonstrate that. Thank you very much.
Thank you.